and subscribe.
And now, it's story time.
I was 18 and in my last year at school. Now I'm 27 and the memories of that Halloween night still haunt me. My friends and I loved to party at school, and Halloween was the perfect night for dressing up and behaving a little crazy. My friends always got the attention of boys, but none of them seemed interested in me beyond friendship. That night, the party was at Steven's house, and as at many high school parties, the alcohol consumption got out of hand, and by 11 p.m. the police had already been called because of noise complaints. After the party broke up, we all fled to avoid being arrested or having our details taken. Amy, my friend and roommate, was driving with her boyfriend to another party, but he insisted that I go with his friend Dave in his car and meet us there. And although I didn't want to go anywhere with this stranger, in the end I reluctantly agreed. The trip was quite uncomfortable. It was just him and me. We didn't know each other and we didn't have much to say. The car smelled of cheap cigarettes and sweat, and it was very dirty too, but obviously I didn't say anything. Dave was wearing a mask on his lap, a hooded sweatshirt, blue jeans and brown work boots, as well as having an unkempt beard and greasy hair. Trying to break the attention a little, I tried to start a conversation with him, but he didn't seem interested in answering my questions. Finally, I asked him what school he went to, and he replied that he had left university a few years ago. So I asked him how old he was, and in a hesitant voice he told me he was 25. At that moment, I got a bit scared, because he was much older than me, and he had left university at 20. What's more, I was leaving a high school party with him. What was a 25-year-old guy doing at a high school party in the first place? I tried to hide the nervousness that had set in and asked him how he knew Amy, but his answer made my stomach turn. He replied with a trembling voice, Who's Amy? At that moment I sank into my seat, not knowing what to do. She's the blonde who told me to get in the car with you. He continued to look straight ahead and replied with, Oh yeah, her. Well, she told me you were single. I didn't reply. I didn't know what to say. Between my nerves and the growing fear that was taking hold of me, I wondered if he really didn't know Amy, or if he was just drunk and confused. At that moment I sent Amy a message to tell her how angry I was with her, but she didn't reply. After about 10 or 15 minutes that seemed like an eternity, we arrived at a house that didn't seem to be in a very good part of town, at least not in the areas where I used to party. I looked everywhere for Amy's boyfriend's car or any other familiar car, but it was too dark to see anything. Finally, we approached a red door with peeling paint, illuminated only by a very poor light. Dave entered the house without warning, so I kept hoping to see a familiar face. The first thing I noticed was that the house was freezing and it smelled terrible. Then we entered what looked like the living room, but it was dirty, with an olive green carpet and an old brown round sofa. The walls were white, but the paint was chipped and there were stains everywhere. There were also lots of pizza boxes and beer cans lying on the floor, all lit by a very dim lamp. On the sofa, a man and a woman were sitting very close together, almost as if they had fainted or were lost in a drunken stupor, and that made me feel very uncomfortable. Then we went to the kitchen, which was just as disgusting and smelled even worse. There was a guy there, about 20 years old, who seemed to be pretty stoned. He greeted Dave and introduced himself to me with a, Hey, how's it going? He looked at me with a smile that made my hair stand on end, and his gaze gave me a very bad feeling. There was also an older man, maybe 45 or 50, but he didn't say anything. He just looked at me in a way that made my stomach turn over. In short, the place was creepy. And if I didn't run away right away, it was because I had no idea where I was, or if these people were dangerous, and I could end up worse. I sent Amy another message, but again she didn't reply. I decided not to call her because I had 5% battery left and I wanted to save it in case I had to call the emergency services. Imagine how little confidence all this gave me. After that, Dave took me to a kind of screened-in porch and I felt a little relieved to see 6 or 7 people around, but there were only 2 girls there. both half naked and not weighing even 40 kilos. I felt like everyone was looking at me, but at least I wasn't alone with Dave. I know it sounds weird, but I felt safer around more people, whoever they were, than alone with this guy I didn't know and didn't feel comfortable with. Although that feeling didn't last long, because after a while, the two girls left with the guys who were on the porch, went into the house and disappeared. While I was sitting on the porch trying to think of what to do to get out of this mess, Dave suddenly said to me, "Hey, you're very pretty," looking at me in a way that I didn't like at all. I thanked him and shrugged my shoulders, trying to appear unconcerned, although inside I was a bundle of nerves. Suddenly he got up and started to massage my back while breathing heavily. I was completely paralyzed, stiff and wanting to run away, but I knew I had to keep calm if I wanted to get out of this situation unscathed. I felt like slapping Amy for what she had done to me, but I was already there, and I had to manage on my own. After about 5 minutes of the most unpleasant massage of my life, Dave stood in front of me and asked me if I wanted to go somewhere more intimate. With a trembling voice, I told him that I wasn't that kind of girl, and at that moment, my heart skipped a beat when I saw the anger reflected on his face. We remained silent for a few seconds, and immediately I felt tears starting to well up. I was so nervous and scared that I couldn't help it. Dave's look made it clear to me that he didn't like my answer at all, and his posture became so threatening that it seemed like he was about to jump me at any moment. But then something incredible happened. One of the girls who had come in earlier started screaming like crazy, insulting everyone and threatening to stick a knife in who knows who. But this completely brought Dave's attention, who shot inside the house, running up the stairs and leaving me completely alone on the porch. That was all it took. Without thinking twice, I got up, ran across the patio, jumped over the small wooden fence and set off running down the street. I didn't care if I didn't know where I was or where I was going. I just wasn't going to stop until I reached a gas station or some public place where they could help me. I was running down the street, hugging the sidewalk, trying not to fall, until luckily I came to a Walmart that was open 24 hours. I went in without looking back and immediately asked the manager for help. Fortunately, both he and the other employees were extremely kind to me. The manager called my parents because my cell phone had turned off and gave them my location so they could come get me. It was about 30 minutes from my parents' house, so it wouldn't take them long to get there, and that gave me some relief. But just when I thought I could relax and forget everything that had happened, Dave and one of his friends entered the Walmart. At that moment, my heart started racing and I reflexively hid behind a counter. Fortunately, they didn't see me, but I couldn't believe they were in the same store. I also noticed that they were looking everywhere as if they were looking for something or someone, and I was sure that someone was me. The next day, Amy called me to apologize, crying and asking me what she could do to make it up to me. I was somewhat consoled that she confirmed that it was Dave I had left with and not a stranger. But even so, I was traumatized thinking about what could have happened. In the end, I forgave her. I assumed she was too drunk to think straight, but not before I had a few words with her. It's been almost 10 years since that night, and although Amy and I are no longer roommates, we are still friends and we talk from time to time. I get really scared when I remember that, because I know it could have been much worse and that I was lucky to get out unscathed. But even so, I wouldn't wish what I went through that night on my worst enemy. I haven't seen Dave again, or the other guy I was looking for, or anyone from that house, and I hope I never will again. In my first year at university, I had to live in halls with a random roommate. I thought it wouldn't be a problem because I'm quite sociable and I make friends easily. I imagined that my new roommate would be a normal, cool guy, and even if we didn't have the same tastes, I obviously hoped that we would have interests in common and that we could be good colleagues because I didn't know anyone at university. Well, when I moved into the residence hall, my roommate wasn't there. I knew his name was Ryan and his things were there, but I had no idea where he had gotten to. My parents helped me get settled that day, and then they left, but Ryan still hadn't shown up. In fact, he didn't show up until the next day, when I returned from my first class and had a gap before the next one. There he was, sitting at his desk, apparently studying. Ryan was average looking, neither tall nor short, neither fat nor thin. He wore glasses and had short blonde hair. At first glance, he didn't seem very friendly, and when I entered the room, he turned and looked me up and down, but he didn't even say hello. He just looked back at his desk. I tried not to give too much importance to his unfriendly action, and I greeted him with a hello. I approached and held out my hand to shake it in order to finally introduce ourselves and break the initial ice a little. I remember that he hesitated a little, but finally he shook my hand. After that, we talked a little. I asked him questions about himself, and he told me that he wasn't a first year like me, but a second year, and that he was from a small town a few hours away. However, after that, things got weirder and weirder. Ryan wasn't usually in the room, but when he was, I would sometimes try to talk to him, but he always gave me short answers and never asked me anything about myself. I thought maybe he was shy or not good at interacting with people, but one day he told me very seriously to leave him alone and not to talk to him again. He was quite rude on that occasion, and he no longer seemed like a shy boy, but a total rude. Even so, I didn't want the semester to be a drag because of him, so I decided not to argue and let it be. I decided he would stay on his side of the room and I would do my thing on mine. As the weeks went by, Ryan would sometimes leave for days at a time. When I woke up, he was already gone, and at night he was often still not there. After several days, he would come back into the room as if nothing had happened, or he would come back and be there. I never bothered to ask him where he had been or anything like that, because I knew he didn't want me to talk to him. But I was curious about what he was doing outside. I remember that one night Ryan left the room, and later, around 11 o'clock, I heard voices in the hallway. I leaned out to see what was happening, and I realized that two guys were arguing loudly. I quickly recognized Ryan's voice among them. He was shouting at someone to shut up. The next day I found out that it was another guy in the flat he had shouted at, and that they had almost come to blows. But the craziest thing is that it seems that the other boy had only said "what's up" to him when they crossed paths in the corridor, and just for that Ryan had jumped on his neck telling him not to talk to him, which made the other boy get angry and confront him. In the middle of the argument, the other boy threw a few punches at Ryan, but Ryan dodged them and ran away. I found out about all this because the other boy came to talk to me and told me that my classmate was a weirdo, and that I should be careful because he could be dangerous. It was then that I started to worry about Ryan's behavior, and as the weeks went by, I just hoped that I would be assigned a different classmate the following semester. In the meantime, I ignored Ryan, and he ignored me. The truth is that it wasn't so bad because he usually left, and it was like I had the room to myself. The bad thing was that I never knew when Ryan was going to come back or how long he was going to be there. So one day I got up and went to class. Ryan had left at night and was still gone, and I was out for several hours in my classes, but when I went back to the room, I went in and saw that everything I had on my side of the room had disappeared. This was the craziest thing I had ever seen. The bed, the desk, and the chair that came with the room were still there, but literally everything I had vanished. My books, my blankets and pillows, my clothes, my snacks, everything had disappeared. Ryan's side of the room was the same, but he wasn't there, so I went into the room and started looking around trying to understand what had happened. I was sure I had locked the door when I left, and of course I immediately suspected Ryan. I started to look on his side of the room, and the truth is that he didn't have much stuff, just some clothes, some blankets, and some notebooks. There was no place where I could put all my things. At that moment I started to get seriously worried, and it was then that fear and indignation overwhelmed me. How is it possible that my things could have been stolen like that? Although I had no proof, I was sure that Ryan had something to do with it. After realizing that my things were definitely not in the room, I went out into the hallway and went to see the residence assistant. I told him what had happened, and we did a little investigation looking around the building and called campus security. But unfortunately the building was very old and had no security cameras inside. Luckily I had already made some friends, and one of them had a single room, so I stayed in his extra bed for the next 2 nights. An investigation was carried out and Ryan was nowhere to be found for several days, but they did find my things. They were lying in a forest near the campus. However, a couple of days later, Ryan finally turned up, but not in the way we expected. His body was found in the same forest where my belongings had been found, and subsequent forensic analysis determined that he had died of an overdose. In the pocket of his sweatshirt was a watch that belonged to me and a ring that my father had given me, which corroborated my suspicions that he was the one who had stolen my things. Despite that, I really felt bad for him. He was a weird and a bit creepy guy, but I wasn't happy about his death. It seemed really sad to me to see how a young life, like mine or anyone else's, is lost in that way because of addiction. After that, I asked to be moved to another room. I really couldn't bear to be there. In fact, a few days after the incident, I even heard Ryan's voice and even the sound of the shower being turned on. I didn't know if that was the result of the shock of what had happened, or if Ryan really wanted to torment me. I just wanted to get out of there and never go back to that room again. I worked in a home for the elderly and disabled. The owners were two older ladies called Grace and Gertrude, a couple of friends who ran the business together. Grace was a delight. She was the real owner of the place, while Gertrude was her partner and roommate, because they both lived on the floor above. The latter was something I never understood. Why did they want a whole flat to themselves? What's more, Grace used to get sick after eating, with a high fever and vomiting, and my job was to clean the house. One day I was mopping the floor when I heard Grace coughing and found her sitting on the stairs. I ran to her immediately, trying to help her. "Are you okay, Mrs. Grace? Do you want me to call a doctor?" She told me that she had been unwell lately and that she couldn't stomach almost anything she ate, so she needed me to give her the injection, because Gertrudis, who usually did it, had gone to the market to do some shopping. Well, I wasn't a nurse, but I grew up in hospitals because my father worked there, so I took Grace to her room and gave her the injection, thinking that she might have had an allergic reaction to some seasoning that was often put on the food. Their room was simple, with the bed near the sealed window, and Gertrudis's room was right next to the door. Grace began to feel better little by little. She drank water and thanked me for helping her, and I took the opportunity to clear up a doubt. I asked her why they both lived in one room when there were 3 empty ones on that floor. She told me it was because Gertrudis insisted on it, as her health was not good, and she suffered from allergies from time to time, so she gave her all the medication and looked after her. At that moment I frowned and looked at the bedside table full of medicines and an empty bottle. I memorized the name of the bottle to find out what it was for because I had never heard of that medicine. Although I had no proof, a spark inside me lit up. Somehow my intuition told me that perhaps Gertrudis was not the selfless and concerned friend she claimed to be. Was this possible? Could she be making her friend sick on purpose? I didn't know, but I wanted to find out. Suddenly, Gertrudis appeared in the room, pushing open the door. She seemed angry and shouted at me, "How dare you enter our room? Don't you know that no one is allowed up here?" I apologized for that, but Grace intervened and explained what had happened. Gertrudis said nothing, but I noticed her discomfort at having a third person in the room, which increased my suspicions. From that day on, I began to pay special attention to Gertrudis, and one day I saw her hiding a bag under the kitchen sink, stealthy as a cat in the middle of the night. She hid the plastic bag and ran up the stairs, supposedly to get water, but she stayed in the dark and I watched her. After a few minutes, I went to the kitchen and looked behind it, and there I found piles of bills wrapped in newspapers. Where did she get this money? Could she be stealing from Grace? I was sure that Gertrudis was not a good person and that she had dark intentions. I started to watch her more closely and saw that she was giving Grace too many injections, and every time she was asked, she said it was to relieve the pain. Poor Grace thought she was getting old. But then one day she became very ill and unfortunately did not recover. Gertrude told everyone that Grace had died of old age, and the truth is that nobody really cared. But after Grace's death, she became the new owner of the residence and opened the second floor for new tenants. I wanted to leave my job, but I was afraid to leave these innocent people in her hands. I was convinced that she had killed Grace, but I had no proof. After a few weeks, the situation became even tenser. There was a man called Charlie who lived with us. He was shy but polite and never caused any trouble. One day I saw him asking Gertrudis about some money that his family had sent him, but Gertrudis told him that no check had arrived in her name that month. But I had seen Gertrudis go to the bank with Charlie's check myself. My God, she was cashing the checks without Charlie knowing. That night I woke up to the sound of digging at the back of the house, so I looked out of the window and saw Gertrudis again, this time burying something in the backyard. Before I could see what it was, she stopped and turned to face me directly. I will never forget her eyes. She looked like a deranged psychopath, with a malicious smile on her face. My legs felt like they were going to give way, so I went back to my bed and locked the door. I was afraid she would visit me in my sleep. The next morning, I went to call Charlie for breakfast, but he was gone. His clothes and his books had disappeared. "Are you looking for something?" Gertrudis asked me from behind. "Where is Charlie?" I asked her. "He's gone to see his family," she said bluntly. "You let him go alone?" I asked her, unable to hide my disbelief. Then she replied, "He is a grown man and I don't have to explain myself to you. Do you think I don't know that you spy on me? I bet you steal from my room when I leave the house, you dirty witch." She spat at me. Suddenly, this crazy old woman pounced on me and bit me on the cheek, almost tearing off a piece of skin with her strong yellow teeth. I screamed in pain and started to call for help, raising a commotion that was heard throughout the house. In the end, I ran out of that place, knowing that my life was in danger, since it wasn't the first time that this woman had murdered someone to get them out of the way. However, I couldn't just sit back and do nothing, so I managed to contact Charlie's family and told them about my suspicions. They confirmed that he hadn't returned to them, and realizing that he was missing, they called 911. From there, the dark truths came to light. Gertrudis was taken to the police station and questioned. I told the police everything I had seen and they decided to search the house. At first they didn't find anything inside, but they started digging in the backyard, and 5 minutes later the residence was all over the news. They had found 7 bodies buried there. All of them had been murdered and buried with their belongings. I went to see Gertrudis before her trial began, and she was sitting behind bars, hiding her face in her hands. For a moment I thought she was having second thoughts, but when she looked up at the sound of my footsteps, my blood ran cold. Her eyes were full of hatred. She seemed furious, but suddenly she smiled and said something that still gives me nightmares. "I should have poisoned you too with grace that day." I'll tell you this horror story that happened to me when I lived with Leah, my ex-roommate. It turns out that a year ago I graduated and I had to share a house with this girl I knew from university. And although we knew each other and got on well, the truth is that we were more like acquaintances and not exactly friends. During the year that we lived together, everything was fine. No more. Each to our own, working and doing our own thing. The neighborhood we lived in was a quiet place and there were never any problems. But all this tranquility that we had had up until now was turned upside down when there was less than a month left on the contract. By that time, I already had some savings and I was planning to find something in the next few weeks. An apartment or a simple house, something like that. And Leah too, as far as I knew. But each one on their own, that's for sure. Well, one night I was in my room, up until late at night, when suddenly I started to hear strange noises, as if there were people in the house. At first I didn't think much of it as my door was closed and I thought maybe Leah had brought someone over. However, after a few minutes, I heard Leah scream, and suddenly, wham, they kicked open my bedroom door, and when I looked over there, my heart almost stopped. There were 3 guys dressed in black from head to toe and wearing masks. It looked like a scene from a movie. I have no words to describe the panic I felt. I had no idea who these guys could be or what they were looking for in my room. So my head was filled with 1,000 questions and terrifying possibilities. Suddenly, one of them came in and immediately started rummaging through all my things, and the others signaled for me to stand in a corner and stay still. Obviously, I immediately obeyed, so I stood there scared to death, watching as the guys grabbed my things and threw them on the floor, while they stole everything they could. They took my cell phone, my laptop, my wallet, some jewelry, and a few other things. They put everything they could into bags and then left the room. All this lasted about 2 or 3 minutes, and once they had ransacked my room, they went straight to Leah's room and did the same thing. The truth is that we didn't have much of value, so the guys took 4 more things and left in less than 5 minutes. It was all super fast, but very scary. I didn't know what to do. I was scared, nervous, and in shock, but at least I had the consolation that they didn't hurt us. Both Leah and I were fine, and that was the most important thing in the end. However, we both felt awful when we realized that they had taken everything from us, and as we no longer had our cell phones, we had to go to a neighbor's house to ask him to call the police. The police arrived about 15 minutes after the call, and we told them what had happened in detail. They took note and said they were going to have a look around the area, but come on, the guys must have been pretty far away by then. Although I didn't see what kind of car they got in or anything, I assumed they weren't on foot. I don't know how they got into the house either, but I figured we must have left the door open, although I could have sworn I closed it before going to my room. Leah looked just as baffled as I did, but she also thought we'd left the front door open. After that, I did what anyone would do, which was to go out and buy a new cell phone and try to get a new license and all the paperwork, a complete headache because I had nothing left, no laptop, no credit cards, nothing at all. So I had to go through all that tedious paperwork again. After the incident, it also took me several days to get back to normal, and what's more, I had to hurry to settle into my new apartment because our lease had already expired. However, there was something that was bothering me. During the last 2 weeks that I shared a house with Leah, I noticed something quite strange. Her laptop was still there, intact. I was quite surprised that the thieves hadn't taken it, but she explained to me that it had been under a blanket on her bed and that she had simply been lucky. I didn't want to think the worst, but I couldn't help feeling skeptical. In the end, I decided to ignore it and leave the matter behind. In the days following the robbery, I called the police department several times to inquire about the progress of the investigation, but Leah always insisted that I let it go, arguing that it was unlikely that we would get our things back. I was honestly surprised by her attitude, as she didn't seem as interested as I was in bringing those responsible to justice, and that made me somewhat suspicious. A few days before the rental contract on our house ended, I was able to move into my new apartment, so I moved all my belongings there and settled in. But despite this, I still had the keys to the house, and I had planned to return on the last day to do a general cleaning. Apparently, Leah was not aware of my intentions, because when I arrived at the house, I noticed an unknown car parked in the driveway. When I saw it, I decided to park across the street and observe the situation without leaving my car. A few minutes passed, and that was when I saw 3 men get out of the car carrying several rucksacks. The guys went towards the door of the house where Leah met them and let them in, although I couldn't visually confirm that they were the same individuals who had committed the robbery, as I didn't manage to see their faces that night. The situation seemed extremely suspicious and incriminating to me. I stayed in the car for a couple of minutes, observing the house, and shortly afterwards, the men came out of the house, without the rucksacks they had been carrying when they went in. I wasn't going to be left in the dark, so as soon as they left, I decided to go into the house and find out if my suspicions were true or not. On entering, Leah was very surprised to see me. Her attitude itself was almost a confession. It was clear that she did not expect to see me there, and of course she knew that I saw the guys leave. Not even a minute had passed. That was all I needed, so I confronted her and asked her who those men were. She tried to play down the situation, claiming that they were just old friends. But I wasn't going to be taken in by that story. Without hesitation, I directly accused her of having planned the robbery. But of course, she flatly denied my accusations and tried to throw me out of the house, but I immediately went to the police station to report my suspicions, and the police didn't hesitate to go after her. In the end, it turned out that my suspicions were correct. The police were already investigating these men, who had tried to sell my laptop at a nearby pawn shop. However, the pawn shop employees had realized that the device had been stolen and refused to buy it, which alerted the authorities. As a result of the investigation, the men were arrested, and Leah finally admitted to letting them into the house and to having faked the whole incident. She was willing to do all that just to steal around $33,000 in belongings from me. After this terrible experience, I have decided that I will never have a roommate again, unless it is someone I know very well and trust completely. When I turned 22, I went to study in Michigan, and looking for cheap accommodation, I found a shared flat on Craigslist that seemed perfect. 2 rooms close to the university and at a good price, so I contacted the girl who lived there, Charlo, 20 years old. She was tall, with black hair and makeup that made her look ghostly. I thought she was a nice person, although a bit shy, but we connected well and she told me I could move in straight away, so we went out for pizza to celebrate, and that's when I started to notice some strange things. During dinner, he kept telling me that I looked like Brad Pitt, which obviously flattered me, but it also made me feel a little uncomfortable, because I don't look anything like him, so I didn't understand where that was coming from. Anyway, when we got back to the flat, he asked me if I wanted to see his room, and when we went in, I noticed a very strong smell of perfume, which already seemed strange to me. But what really made my blood run cold was seeing the walls full of Brad Pitt posters. He even had photos of him stuck to the mirror, and all his films arranged on a shelf. It left me speechless. It was a full-blown obsession, and I got a very bad feeling when he insisted that I looked like him, because it was clear that he had a problem. Over the following weeks, I hardly saw her. We didn't spend time together. She would come home from work and lock herself in her room. Sometimes I would hear a very strange giggle coming from behind the walls, and I would wonder what on earth she was doing, although other times she would just stand in the hallway staring at me while I was in the living room. When I would notice and greet her, she would remain silent, with an inscrutable expression, and then she would let out her chilling giggle, which made me feel very uncomfortable and vulnerable in the situation. One night, I woke up around 2 in the morning because I heard what sounded like the front door opening. My heart started beating very fast, so I decided to leave my room and saw that all the lights were off. Charla was standing by the door with her face pressed against it, moving the bolt again and again while murmuring, "Fred, Fred, Fred." Seeing her like that in the dark, repeating my name, was very scary. It was a disturbing moment, so I asked her if she was okay. She turned her head slowly, without moving the rest of her body. She looked at me fixedly and then went back to her room. That really scared me. So I decided to look for another place to live the next morning. I was having breakfast when the doorbell rang. I thought Charla was still sleeping, so I opened the door and found 2 policemen with unfriendly faces. One of them asked me if Charlo lived there. I was confused for a moment, but I said yes, that I was his roommate, and I asked what was going on. Then they told me they had come to arrest her for the murder of Ethan Diaz. I couldn't believe it. He was her former roommate. At that moment, there was a loud bang and a window broke from Charlo's room. The cops pushed me aside and ran over there. I followed them. They tried to open the door, but it was locked, so they started knocking while shouting her name. "Charlo, open the door. We know what you've done, or we'll break it down," shouted one of the policemen as he banged on the door. Getting no response, the police broke down the door, revealing a terrifying scene, but Charlo was no longer there. He had escaped by jumping out of the window. The room was in chaos and the stench was unbearable. While inspecting the room, one of the officers opened the wardrobe, and there he was, a decomposing corpse, with worms crawling over his skin, dressed in old clothes and a grotesque paper mask with Brad Pitt's face. When they removed the mask, they discovered that the deceased's face was disfigured, with deep cuts and burns indicating a terribly painful death. Within a couple of hours, the paramedics arrived and took away the body, which they identified as that of Ethan Diaz, Charlo's former roommate, a 20-year-old who had disappeared months earlier. The police launched a full-scale investigation looking for a psychopathic woman who had murdered her roommate. I immediately had to leave the apartment, which was sealed off by the police, and find accommodation in a motel. Then I called my parents and told them everything that had happened. My mother was glad that nothing had happened to me. A few days later, while looking for a new flat, I saw a woman across the street at a bus stop, wearing a Brad Pitt mask, and I knew right away that it was Charlo. I called the police, but before they could arrive, she had disappeared. From that moment on, I felt like Charlo was watching me everywhere I went. It was a chilling sensation. After thinking about it, I decided to move to another city. I didn't want anything to do with that woman. I felt that her appearance was a warning, a death threat. Shortly after, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood was released, and they put up a huge billboard with Brad Pitt's image on the street. I saw it every day on my way to work until one day I saw some police cars and a crowd of people looking up. When I looked up, I saw her. It was Charlo. Hanging from an electric cable attached to the billboard, her clothes were in tatters and she looked like she had been living in the woods, but this time she wasn't laughing. She was just hanging there, her body slowly swaying in the wind. Her obsession with Brad Pitt had led her to climb the advertising billboard and touch the high-voltage cable, dying of electrocution. Her face was more horrifying than before, and with her eyes fixed on the sky, as if she had finally found peace in the deification of her idol. We've We've all had roommates at some point, right? They can be a blessing or sometimes a real headache. Let me tell you about an experience I had with my girlfriend Angela and I were taking our first steps into the world of work. We had just graduated, and although we got some initial jobs in startups that made social networking applications, the money wasn't enough to pay rent on our own. So we set out to find a good place and found an amazing apartment online. We loved it from the start, but there was one small detail. It was a bit more expensive than we could afford, so we had to share it with someone else, although we didn't want to. The decision was out of our hands. The owner of the place was quite friendly, and he had already found another tenant, a guy called Andres, who was coming to live with us. We met him before moving in, and although he seemed a bit strange, we didn't think much of it. I noticed that we lived in a nice area, and although I could have gotten something on my own, the place was on the outskirts of the city, which made it more attractive. I told Angela it was okay. We weren't going to stay with him forever, and that reassured us. So we started packing, and before we knew it, we were in our new home. The guy hadn't arrived yet, but the owner decided to give us the keys. When we went inside, the place was quite spacious, exactly what we needed. It was a real stroke of luck. After unpacking, we managed to personalize our space. Angela hung up a couple of pictures she had, which gave it a cozy touch. We decided to explore the rest of the apartment, but we came across a locked door. That was Andres's room. We found it curious, but in the end we thought it was normal to want some privacy. Life went smoothly at first. We set to work cleaning as the place needed a little TLC. My girlfriend Angela, as she took off her gloves, commented on how nice everything was looking after our cleaning. Then everything was going well until we heard the front door open. Angela jumped up and got out of bed, and I quickly followed her. We left the room hoping to say hello to Andres, but when he appeared, he just went straight into his room without saying a word. The door to his room closed behind him, and we stood there in the living room a little confused. My girlfriend thought he was quite rude, but I thought maybe he was just shy. The night went on as planned. We got comfortable in bed, enjoyed some snacks, and watched romantic comedies on Netflix. Everything seemed normal, but a strange feeling still lingered in the air. Although we had a good time, that little interaction with Andres left me intrigued. What would happen with Andres? The next day, I woke up before my girlfriend, so I decided to make myself a little coffee in the kitchen. I was half asleep, and while I was gathering some energy, I bumped into Andres. "Good morning," I said with a smile, but he just looked at me as if he were examining every inch of me. Instead of replying, he commented, "Nice shoes, they look expensive." I was confused for a moment, and then I remembered that I had left my shoes in the hallway the night before. They were designer shoes, so yes, it had taken me a while to save up for them. I told him this, but his face showed no emotion. He was still serious. "Take good care of them, you don't want to lose them," he replied. When Angela woke up, I told her about the strange encounter, but she was too dazed with sleep to worry. So we changed the subject. Then it was time to go to work. I started looking for my old iPhone everywhere, but I couldn't find it. It was an old model, but I had a lot of good memories of it. I asked Angela if she had seen it, but her phone was out of battery. We tried calling it, but it seemed to be switched off. I thought about looking for it when I got back later. That day, while we were chatting, Angela and I commented that Andres was starting to scare us a little, and something about the way he didn't blink when he spoke was a bit unsettling. That night, I got back from work a little early, and Angela hadn't come home yet, but Andres had. I asked him if he had seen my phone, but he acted as if I had accused him of stealing it. "What would I do with an old slow phone?" he exploded. That surprised me. "How do you know it's old?" I asked him. Without answering, he turned around and closed the door behind him. I didn't see him again all night. The next day was Saturday, and we woke up around noon. We had a quick breakfast and then decided to go for a walk. As we were walking through the park, my girlfriend asked me, "Have you seen my earrings?" "Which ones?" I asked. "The little gold ones, I left them on the table," she said. When we got home, we searched everywhere, but without success. There was only one place left to look, Andres's room, and I started to feel really worried. First my phone, now his earrings. Something wasn't right. But what made me most uncomfortable was that our belongings would just disappear, and there were only 3 of us living here, so it was impossible for them to just vanish. After spending the whole day out, we got back home around 9:30 p.m. I felt like playing some Call of Duty, so I went upstairs to turn on the PS4, but to my surprise, it wasn't there. I went straight to Andres' room and tried to open the door as usual, but it was locked. I knocked, but got no response, so I told my girlfriend to call the police. They arrived quickly and began searching the building for him. An hour passed and they still hadn't found Andres. In the end, they decided to call a locksmith to open his door. When we went in, I was astonished. Andres' room was completely different from what I thought. His room was very clean and tidy, like a show. The whole room was spotless and shiny. The police searched, but they didn't find any of our things. They told us they would contact us again if they found anything. My girlfriend and I looked at each other worried. At that moment, Angela's phone rang. It was the police who had tracked down Andres' car. We got in, and as we closed the door, an avalanche of things fell to the floor. Among them were my PS4, my phone, and my girlfriend's earrings, along with other things that definitely didn't belong to him. He was arrested shortly afterwards. In the end, we got a new roommate, and this time, we hoped he would be normal. After the experience with Andres, Angela and I learned a valuable lesson. Not everyone is who they appear to be. Sometimes appearances can be deceiving, and it's important to trust our instincts. Although necessity led us to share our space with a stranger, we now know that peace of mind and security are priceless. Sometimes it is better to sacrifice certain comforts to protect what really matters, our peace of mind and our integrity. My name is Katie, I'm 31 years old, and 5 years ago I accepted a very good job in another city, so I moved. There I met Sarah, a girl a year younger than me, super talented and beautiful, who was really cool. I was new in town, but she had been working in my office for 3 or 4 years, and she offered me her flat because she used to live alone, but a friend had moved to another city, so she told me I could be her flatmate, and that suited me perfectly. We had a great time together. I must say we became super friends, and when we left the office, we would go out drinking and enjoy the city's nightlife. What's more, she had a boyfriend, Harris. But one day she came back from a date with him feeling devastated and extremely worried. "What's the matter, Sarah?" I asked her, concerned. "Well, nothing. It's just that my boyfriend cheated on me and he's going to marry someone else. He says we can't be together," she said to me in tears. I tried to cheer her up, but she wouldn't budge. "I don't want to see his face. His promises were a complete lie," she said. At that moment, I did what any good mining engineer would do. I simply consoled her and tried to cheer her up. "Don't cry for a guy who doesn't value you. It's better to get away from those people. It's not your fault." Sarah was super depressed and worried, of course, about the dirty trick that had been played on her. I tried to support her as best I could, but she was still crying her eyes out. It took her days to recover, but I encouraged her a lot, and in the end, her spirits lifted a little. After 20 or 25 days, she was finally smiling, and that meant she was getting over her broken heart. But one day, she left the office saying that her little sister was coming to visit her, so she would be late. That afternoon, when I was in the apartment, I heard a frantic knock on the door, and when I opened it, I realized it was Sarah, but she had a bump on her head. "Hey, what happened to you?" I asked her, alarmed, but she didn't answer. "Are you okay? Are you hungry?" I continued, but nothing. She simply walked like an automaton and went into the room. She seemed tired and strange, and I noticed that she wasn't carrying her cell phone or her bag. This really worried me, but she didn't want to say anything more. It was clear that she wasn't going to answer me because she didn't want to talk. The next day, I woke up to a noise in the kitchen and saw Sarah making breakfast. Fish? But she's a vegetarian and doesn't eat that kind of thing. Her behavior was really strange, but I didn't want to question her. I thought maybe she was still grieving the separation, and maybe that was her way of coping. But I did ask her about her phone, and she told me it had been stolen on the way. We both went to the office after breakfast and had a normal day. We took a taxi home, but she started doing strange things in the taxi, looking out the window and saying nonsense things. "What if I jump out of the moving taxi?" she said to me at one point. "What are you saying, Sarah? You're joking, right?" But she hadn't finished saying it when Sarah opened the door and jumped out of the taxi. I was shocked for a moment, unable to assimilate what had just happened, but I let out a scream of terror, and asked the driver to stop the taxi. The taxi driver was also scared and slammed on the brakes, which almost made me fly out of the seat, as I wasn't wearing a seatbelt. Immediately, we both ran to where Sarah was. I was crying and desperate. "Sarah, are you okay?" But she didn't answer. The only thing that reassured me was that she was conscious, and at one point she just rubbed her head, got up and walked as if nothing had happened. She was in shock, but at least she was okay. I thought everything was going well, but her behavior was getting too strange, and everything pointed to the fact that she was still in shock over the horns. That was my theory. I insisted that we go to the hospital, but she flatly refused. The next day I bought tickets to the cinema to cheer her up, so we went to see a movie and had a great time. Everything seemed to be returning to normal with her, and that gave me some relief. After we got back, she suggested we watch another movie on Netflix that she said was excellent. It was a horror movie, and although I'm not a big fan, I agreed for her sake. At one point, Sarah went to the bathroom and I stayed in the hallway watching TV. The truth is that the movie was scaring me a lot, and although I tried to change the channel, the same horror movie kept coming up again and again. It was as if the TV was trolling me. In that scene, you could see someone hitting the TV remote. "What the hell?" I said under my breath. But suddenly the television turned itself off and I heard a strange noise coming from behind. I turned around and saw a very scary woman with a disfigured face and red eyes. She was looking at me and approaching slowly. I screamed in fright, "Sarah, help!" But she didn't come. Instead, the woman grabbed me by the throat and started to strangle me. I tried to call Sarah with all my might, but she couldn't hear me. At that moment, I was suffering like a fish out of water, and suddenly she threw me against the TV with such force that I fell on top of it. After a while, I fainted, but when I came to, I found a chip behind the television. I checked it, and what I saw there left me cold. There were only videos and photos of Sarah and her boyfriend naked. I ran to the police station. I was scared shitless and praying that it wasn't my friend. But what I feared happened. The body was Sarah's, and the one who had been with me all this time was her ghost. I gave the police the recording just in case. I was too scared to do or say anything else, but I never went back to the flat. I went to the office to investigate and checked the security camera footage, and discovered that Sarah had never been with me in the 27 days that I had been talking to myself. It was all visible in the photos from the cameras. I found the taxi driver and asked him about that night. I was stunned to hear what he said to me. "Madam, I don't know who you were talking to that day. I felt that a spirit had entered you, and when you asked for the taxi to stop, I was very scared. That's why I left you there. I'm sorry, madam. You were alone in the taxi." A few days later, I went to the cinema and found out that I had been alone to see the movie that day. I could see her spirit everywhere. She wanted peace. That's why I insisted so much to the police to solve the case quickly, and fortunately, they did. It was later discovered that Sarah had video recordings of her and her boyfriend and was blackmailing him with them. She wanted him to take her back. But one day her boyfriend cheated on her and led her into a trap. Harris begged her to delete the videos, but she refused, so he strangled her and threw her into a ditch. That was why the same scene was repeated on TV over and over again. Sarah wanted her to know the truth, but I couldn't. I feel terrible for her. Harris was arrested for murder.
In addition, YouTube's algorithm prioritizes videos with many likes and subscriptions. So, if you enjoyed this video, please click the like and subscribe buttons to help more people see and know about this content. Thank you for watching and listening.